Hi, welcome to this session where I'm going to give you a quick introduction to how to use PowerShell with the various VMware products. Really meant sort of for beginners, but anybody might gain something from it. Okay, so let's crack on. So why do we want to automate? Number of reasons, or rather use PowerShell. Well, consistency, yeah. Humans, do we always do the same thing every time? I think not. Speed, yeah. Okay, you might be able to do a couple of things very fast, but then if you need to do it 100 or 1,000 times, yeah, computers are generally better at that sort of stuff than us mere humans. Do you really want to be doing this stuff at 7 o'clock at night or 3 o'clock in the morning where we can set scheduled tasks to do this? More about that later. And if you're like me, incredibly lazy, then yeah, if someone's probably already done what you want doing already, so that you can then just use their work, as it were, or at least modify it to do what you need it to do. But make sure you know what the script does, that you've tested it, and it's not accidentally or deliberately malicious. Because if it takes down your 50 host VMware environment or your AD or yeah, that's not going to come back too well on you. And I'm sure you've probably got better things to do than admin stuff. Helps, of course, improve your skills as a person so that you can put that on your resume, CV, whatever you want to call it, in terms of job prospects. But obviously being able to automate is a key skill these days. Always has been, to be honest, but it's more prevalent these days. Much easier to hand over something, I find, as well. If you've got a script, particularly if you write a document to explain how to use it, the script itself can be self-documenting, particularly if you put PowerShell help in and you explain what parameters, or even if you put a user interface on it, and therefore less comeback, which is always good, as long as you've made sure that the script does what it should do and there's plenty of error checking in there. Why PowerShell over other languages or techniques? Well, first of all, and one of the reasons I like it, particularly as I started life as a Unix developer many years ago, is that when you can use it interactively as well as a programming language. So something like VBS, Visual Basic Scripting, if you've used that, you can't use it interactively. You have to use it within a script, whereas we've got the best of both worlds with PowerShell, particularly if you're doing stuff that you've done before. As long as you've got a persistent local user profile and machine you're using, like a jump box or your own workstation, then you'll have a history of all the commands. You're going back into the thousands of commands. It's incredibly useful for searching just via this Control R. If you've got a more recent version of PowerShell, older ones like PowerShell 2 or ISE, you have to type hash, the comment character, and then a few characters and tab to find your previous commands. But Control R makes it very easy. But the flip side is, of course, if you're doing things, particularly on a customer site as a consultant, that you don't want them to know that you're doing, then yeah, make sure you delete that persistent profile. But I'm sure none of you have been in that situation, and I never have, of course. And there's a lot of scripts out there already. Yeah, you might think, well, I'm going to write this from scratch, but is there any point? If somebody's already done it, yes, it can help with your learning, but the way I learned programming back in the 1980s was by looking at existing programs, albeit not PowerShell back then, understanding how they worked, and then modifying them and then writing my own from scratch. So just because you're using somebody else's code, you've not written it from scratch, doesn't make you any lesser of a person. In some ways, it makes you smarter because you're not reinventing the wheel. As I said before, make sure the scripts aren't going to do damage to your systems, either in a test environment or a walkthrough. A lot of scripts will support PowerShell's what-if capability, so you can run through, but not necessarily. So you have to check that the code is going to support that, rather than you go, mine is what-if. Worst case, it'll just go and do everything anyway. Again, for lazy people like myself or those with poor memory, we can tab complete a heck of a lot of stuff. The commands themselves, the arguments within them, even some of the parameters to those arguments. It means we have to learn less and we can just write things much more quickly. Huge number of commandlets built in, particularly when you start bringing in third parties, commandlets such as the VMware PowerCLI, Microsoft Azure, Citrix, depending on what exactly your needs are. But again, a lot of built-in methods of getting help for commands themselves, get command or alias GCM, get help itself, even for scripts that people write. Every script I release to GitHub, I'll make sure I've put PowerShell help in it, so you can do a get help on it. And then we also have get member, so we can say, well, I've got this object or I've got this class, what actually can I do with it? And we can do that rather than actually sometimes read the manual. Just, okay, well, we've got this, let's pipe it through get member or GM, the alias, to see what it can do. And once you get the hang of it, particularly with all its sort of object orientation, selecting objects, adding properties, querying properties, sorting, etc., then because most things follow the same pattern, then you can just use the knowledge you've already got, albeit on a different commandlet. So it makes accelerating your knowledge much easier. We have these things called aliases. So a typical one is something like dir. If you're in a PowerShell window, like you would if you're in a legacy CMD prompt, actually dir is just an alias for get child item. Similarly, for those of you who are more of a Unix head, there's ls as an alias for dir because that's what it is on Unix and Linux. But what I would say is please don't use these in scripts because it makes it much harder to understand what the script is doing if you see GMs and GCMs and TNCs and things like that rather than the full command name. And again, because we can tab complete them, you don't really have to type that much, even if it's a long command. And it's very easy to get files in and out of various common formats. A lot of stuff these days is JSON or XML, and PowerShell can natively read and write those. CSVs I use a lot for reporting where there aren't necessarily reporting products and interfaces available for products. And again, hook that up with a scheduled task, hook that up with PowerShell's ability to email, and you've got daily, weekly, monthly reporting at no extra cost other than writing a bit of code, but somebody's probably already done it for you. Okay, so how do we get PowerCLI, which is the VMware PowerShell modules, onto a system? Much easier now than it used to be because we have the ability to do online installation, as long as you trust the sources where those come from. So we can just do an install-module VMware.PowerCLI, and we're installing it. Now, we don't need to run that elevated if I wanted to install it for everyone on the whole machine, but if I was just installing it for myself, I wouldn't even need to install it elevated. Obviously, the commandlets themselves don't need to run elevated because they will need to run with credentials or under an account which has got the required permission in VMware, either ESXi directly or vSphere, vCenter. So we can see what modules we've got available. So, for instance, have I installed the modules? Let's go and get a PowerShell prompt, albeit in Windows Terminal. So I can do a get dash module, and its name, VMware star. Again, lots of pattern matching in PowerShell available too. Just available. We'll see what modules I've actually got available. This is running on my Windows 10 laptop. If I was running this for a automation side of things, I'd probably run it in a jump box. And again, we'll talk about that later. It's basically where you install all the PowerShell modules, consoles, etc. that you're going to need. So we can see we've got various versions here. You can see, for instance, VMware PowerCLI. I've actually had a number of different versions, so I can't specifically request a version, but by default, if I import a module, as in to be able to use its functions, it's going to be the latest version, which at the time of writing is version 12. But we can do an update module at any point as well if we want to, just to make sure that we've got the latest and greatest. Generally, they're backwardly compatible, so there's usually no reason to write anything to work with an older module. We can do it offline as well, because ultimately, when we install a module, all we're doing is downloading some files and moving into a specific folder, either globally or per user in their Documents Windows PowerShell folder so that they can be picked up by the import module command, although import module can take absolute paths as well. Again, I'll make this slide deck available afterwards, which has got links to various articles to give you more information on the things on the slides. So we can actually do a save module. We just need to give it the name of the module we want and a path that must exist, and it will just download and save everything to that path, which I did earlier for PowerShell for VMware, and that was about 1/3 of a gigabyte, a few hundred files. But then I can copy that around any other machine that I need it on. PowerShell, when you do an import module, will pick modules up from the PS module path. So an environment variable, again, environment variables within PowerShell, very easy to look at. So we can do and we'll come back to providers later. So we have an environment provider. So there we can see all our environment variables. For instance, there is PS module path, which we can see is a bit like a path environment variable. But again, we can just go $env PS module path. You can see what but that's a bit difficult to read. So I'm going to say, actually, I'm just going to split on the semicolon character. In fact, that's a regular expression, but hey, look, regular expressions don't need to be scary. So we can see that it's going to pick modules up by default if you don't specify a full path from these given folders. But again, you only need to worry about that if when you come to import your PowerCLI modules that they're not found. Generally, just make sure they're read-only if you're going to give to other people, just so they can't be hijacked. And if you're taking stuff out of zip files, of course, what you'll find with Windows Zip built in, that it will block files. So you can either go File Properties, Unblock, or do a dir and pipe through unblock-file, the PowerShell commandlet, to make sure that not actually blocked. Okay, so let's say we've got the commandlets on a machine that we're going to use. How do we now actually connect to some VMware resources? So either a VMware ESXi host or vCenter itself, depending on what it is you want to do and what you've got in your environment as well. What you'll find is a lot of the commandlets will work without vCenter, so you can just go to an ESXi host and do automation that way. Although certain features, like templating, you won't get within basic ESXi. You need vCenter in there with licenses. So to connect, first of all, we need to import the modules that could give us the connecting commandlets, which happens to be this one. So rather than doing an import module of VMware star, which will take quite a while because it'll import every VMware module for everything that's been installed, including Update Manager, vSAN, etc. We just import the module we wanted. A lot of the basic commandlets for PowerCLI are in this one module. So we just do an import module, or IPMO for aliases if we're doing it interactively, vmware.vimautomation.core. And as long as that doesn't error, then we can start to think about how we're going to connect. So one thing obviously we need to think about is, what credentials are we going to use to connect to, well, I'll say vCenter, but it could be ESXi as well. So do we just pass through the domain credentials that I'm using at the moment? So I'm logged on, let's say, as a domain user, which I'm not actually on my laptop. Therefore, the default would be passed through the credentials, which when I'm doing things on my laptop, of course, won't work because it doesn't know about my laptop. Now, we could then pass through explicit parameters, as in we specify them, not explicit in the other term. So if we then, let's go and look at what I mean by that. So what I'm going to do now, I've already imported the module that I need. I'm going to do Connectvi and then hit tab. Now what I'll do is, one thing you're probably used to is you can tab through arguments. One thing not a lot of people know is you can actually hit Control Space and it will show all of the available arguments, the commandlet specific ones, and then the generic ones like verbose and debug, error action. And I can actually use the cursor keys as I'm doing now, pass through them. And then if you look at the bottom left, you'll see that it actually tells you, the type that it's expecting as well. So you can see here, for instance, it says, what server am I going to connect to? In fact, notice that if you see at the bottom, it says string, open square bracket, close square bracket. That's an array. So it can actually take a comma-separated list of vCenter servers. So if you've got, let's say, 2 in your environment for 2 different sites which aren't linked, then you could actually specify both on the command line, and all the commandlets that you use, such as get-vm to get virtual machines, will actually work across both vCenters automatically. So that can save you time, particularly if you haven't got linked ones, although there is a minus all linked parameter as well. So notice here we have user and password. I'd strongly suggest you don't use these, simply because if you are recording process creations along with command lines, then the username and password will go into the security event log. Now, you do need to be a local admin to get at that, but that local admin may not have access to vCenter. But if you've passed clear text username and password on the command line, then they're going to be able to see that. So that I would strongly suggest you don't do that. Best way to do it, if you need to do it interactively, is via a credential. Credential is very easy to get. So what we can do is we can just literally say $credential, if I can actually spell it, equals get-credential, built in Microsoft Commandlet. I always suggest people put in a message so that you know it's for what it's for, and it's probably not spam. Okay, I can't spell, but it doesn't really matter. So that then pops up this. So if I put my lab domain credentials in, password obviously is blanked out, then I've got a credential that I can then use. The password can be got out of there, but I could actually save it as a secure string locally if I needed to as well. And if we go back to the slide for a moment, so that's how we could pass through explicit credentials via minus credential or clear text passwords, which is a no-no. There's get credential I've just mentioned. Connectvi server does actually have a save credential, so if it prompts, it can then save that credential in a credential store item. So for instance, I've got some that I prepared earlier, and here we go. If we do a get credential store, get VI, credential store item, we can see, and if I did a select star, we'd actually see the password, but only because I'm the user on the machine that actually save those. So these can be a useful way, the credential store items, to have credentials saved on a machine that you're going to run scheduled tasks from, so you don't have to worry about saving or passing credentials through to the script. You just do a one-time saving of those credential store items, unless of course you're using an AD account to run the scheduled task, which has directly got the permissions in vCenter anyway. Again, a number of different ways you can specify credentials, which is pretty key. So we've got the Connectvi server, which we've kind of already seen when I showed you the parameters. It's not particularly exciting commandlet to run. We've got various other options. We can, I've already mentioned, the all linked. So any linked vCenters, again, will all be connected to in one go, so we can get resources, do things across all of them in one go rather than having to iterate over them. And then we've also got the minus force, which will ignore credential, certificate warnings, all that side of things as well. And to ignore things like that, as in the credential certificate warnings, we've got the set PowerCLI configuration. So again, if we do a set PowerCL tab minus control space, you can see the various things we can set here, such as do we want to participate in the customer experience improvement program. whether we want to show deprecation warnings about commandlets that are going to be phased out, timeouts, what our default console is going to be, whether it's going to be the web console or the external VMware VMRC.exe console, so we can set those. And again, we can set them, scope of the whole machine if we're running elevated or just in our own user session if we want to. So we can limit the amount of information that's shown. So if we'd actually do a connect, again, I'm going to use a Control-R there to search back in my history. So that's where I was doing a get command to VI server. We can see that, so we can see what module it is, what version I'm using, etc. We could do a get help on it if we wanted to. Easiest way to do a get help, again, is just to put it in with the -show window. That will probably prop up on one of my other monitors. So I bring that over here and we can see, brings in the whole, what are the parameters, what's the syntax, here's some examples. Or for a lot of them, we can even do -online to get the latest and greatest. So rather than having to use your favorite search engine, then we can just go straight to whatever the default browser is set. Again, open another screen and bring it back over here to give the latest and greatest help. And in some ways, it's a better format to read than the show window text. Anyway, what I was trying to do is show using the persistent command line history. If my cursor wants to play ball, which it doesn't seem to be doing at the moment. Hello, Earth to cursor. So again, Control-R, connect -vi. So again, I'm going to hit Control-R to go through previous ones. So there's one, for instance, one of my vCenter servers in my home lab. And that comes back straight away. It hasn't prompted for credentials. I'm not logged on as a user who's got any access because I'm actually on a local machine called Contoso, just to confuse things if you know the Microsoft demos. But because I've got a connection store saved item for this server, which we saw earlier, then that's connected for me and I can see that in its vCenter object. I don't really need this vCenter object again, unless I do a disconnect VI server to close that connection. But if you're doing this programmatically, it can be useful to test, because if you fail to connect, vCenter will come back as null. So you can just do an if test around that and throw an exception or try different credentials or however else you want to try and recover from that issue. Once we have connected, you'll see there's some global variables. So we can, again, using good old tab complete, if we just type def, you'll see it gets expanded. That's actually HorizonView servers. That's the VI server. So that's what I've just connected to. And you'll see there's another one as well, VI servers. Subtle difference between them. One is a default that it will use if you haven't actually specified any on the connect VI server command line, but I tend not to bother with that. I always want to make sure I know exactly which server I'm connecting to. There are connection duration timeouts, as you'll see. If I do this connection now and come back in, I think my timeout's set to 90 minutes through vCenter. If I come back in 2 hours, then it'll come back and say it's not connected, and you just have to do the connect VI server again. So bear in mind there's timeout for a normal duration script. It shouldn't be a problem, but for longer running scripts, you might have to cater for re-authenticating or at least creating that connection again. Disconnecting at the end, so disconnect-vi server is optional. Take down the resources, but it can be useful to leave it running so that you then don't have to connect VI server again, because you can actually check these variables to see if you're already connected and then just not do the connect if you're already connected. And something I've found is if you've connected, let's say, to an ESXi host directly to do something, and then you connect to a vCenter which manages that ESXi host, and you do something like get VM or get data store, then you will get duplicate objects, because it, as we said before, it queries everything that's connected. So it'll query the vCenter, find everything on all the hosts, and then it will come to the host that you've connected to as well and find all those objects, which is, a bit of a pain, easily to code around. but just watch out for it. It stumped me the first time that I saw that occur. Okay, so we've got a connection. What can we do? Well, what do you want to do? Yeah, pretty much anything you can do in the vSphere Web Console you can do. From simple stuff to snapshot manipulation, power operations, cloning. So there's some built-in cloning stuff, built-in backup stuff. I've written a cloner script for ESXi, so effectively brings templating to ESXi when you don't have vCenter. Although I can strongly suggest a vMug Advanced program so you can get your own licenses, do lots of things with data stores. We'll come back to that in a moment. Reconfigure all sorts of things, from where networks are connected to how much memory, to even just notes for that VM. I'll say pretty much anything you can do in the console. Not always immediately obvious how, but again, that's where go out to the internet, do some searching. Poor man's reporting, if you don't have reporting from any other mechanism. As I said earlier, it's very easy to produce CSV output from PowerShell. You can just do an export-PSV. PSV? Or CSV even if you want. CSV format. I don't know what PSV format is. Although CSV format in the Netherlands is using a semicolon, not a comma, which you can actually specify as a parameter to export-CSV, which is the PowerShell commandlet for exporting to CSV. So something to take into account if you're working in Dutch language. And of course, we can produce HTML relatively easily without it, although there are third-party libraries for doing that sort of side of things, modules. And we can email, again, built in to send SMTP email. So very easy to set up scheduled tasks. Again, we'll come to scheduled tasks shortly. So if you want to do some alerting, probably a good time now to show you a PowerShell script that I use to sort of run my lab where I do a lot of my day-to-day work for my development for customers and testing. So what you see here is a WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation user interface. Not a very pretty one. I'm not really a GUI person. But everything that I can do within here, so this is connected to a particular vCenter, shown all my running VMs. Again, I can actually change it to show all my VMs if I want, or any particular pattern here, just with the filter button. But then once I've got a VM, I can do a lot of things with it from here without having to do anything within the vSphere console itself. So it's ideally meant for developers, app packages, testers, etc., so they can control their own environment or what they've got permission to. Again, vCenter permissions back all this off, so we can do a lot of things from here without having to give them the full web interface, which might confuse them or otherwise. But again, this is all PowerCLI, so if you want some examples of what you can do with PowerCLI, then go to GitHub. Again, references in the deck later on, and go and see what there is in this script, because I rarely use vCenter now other than for creating new VMs. I've even got the ability to run exes or scripts or whatever with a persistent history in there, so I can run all sorts of things against a number of VMs with arguments, bring their results in together. So again, it saves me having to MSTSC onto things, although I can MSTSC from here directly. In fact, I've set it up as my double-click action, so I can literally just double-click on one of these. Again, it doesn't use PowerCLI to launch MSTSC, but it shows you how we can integrate but lots of different vendors' commandlets together. So to give you an idea of the sorts of things we can do within PowerCLI. And I mentioned about being able to run scripts there. There is actually an Invoke VM Script available, which has its advantage that if your VM isn't network connected, so that you wouldn't be able to use PowerShell remoting, or it wasn't running Windows, although of course PowerShell 7 is now available for Linux and other OSs, then PowerShell remoting without a network wouldn't work. But there are various gotchas with it as well, so I tend to enable PowerShell remoting, given it is secure, as long as you don't make it insecure, of course. and that gives me a lot more scope to do things in my VMs, not just from VMware, but from other automation sides of things as well, whether it be from Citrix or just general Microsoft or WVD or whatever else it is I want to do. PowerShell drives. These are interesting little beasts. So we've already seen one PowerShell drive, which was the env PowerShell drive, the environment. So if I do a get-ps drive, you'll see I've got things like the file system, I've actually got certificates, there's my environment, I've even got access to the registry, but these are all the ones down here that we're interested in here, that I can actually look at my inventory and I can look at my data stores. So I do a dir vis : you can, and then I can start to tab complete if I want what's on there, tab complete there. I can see what's in my VMs, for instance. So there's my folders. So you can see we've got folders as well as actual VMs. A couple of VMs not in folders. Then the other PowerShell drive that I've got, which is built in with the PowerCLI, is the VM store. So again, tab complete. So I've got a number of data stores, some local. So the local SSD is on my one host in my lab at the moment, whereas the NAS is all NFS data stores. So I can then see, notice how slow it is. That's one of the downsides of using a data center, using the PS drives, looking at data stores. So if I do another tab, let's go and look at a particular VM. Again, notice how slow the tab completion is. Just to get that, yes, I have really hit tab. I sometimes do doubt myself. There we go. So this has built up its list by querying it. So if we have a look at, let's have a look at that VM, then we can see all the usual files. Again, look at the slowness of it. So it's not an ideal interface. It is a read-write interface, so you can make changes this way, copy files, etc. So yeah, we see our usual VMDKs, VMXs, etc. So we can manipulate and look at files that way, but it is quite slow. So what I tend to use is if I'm just doing anything read-only, then there's a read-only interface via folder. So again, the URL is to your vCenter or ESXi host /folder. It will prompt you for credentials. Of course, we can do this in a script. My PowerShell GUI script does it. So if I wanted to mount a CD, if I pick something that's actually got a CD drive in, that would be useful, wouldn't it? Don't you just love live demos? Then what that will do is actually go away and produce a file chooser on a particular, well, in fact, it picked up the path I last used, which is on one of my NAS boxes, but I can navigate around it much quicker than I could using the PS drive. So I can go and pick up ISOs for Citrix or whatever else, and then just plop those in to the CD drive. And that uses this folder interface. So I can go down, you can see how quick that is. Just bang down folders rather than using the PS drive. So yeah, be wary of PS drives. Also, if you're copying stuff, using any of these mechanisms, where of course if you've got a thin disk, that it may well get converted to a fat disk, simply because the thin is a function of the VMFS file system itself. So if you're copying it somewhere else, you may lose that thinness, although you can convert them back afterwards, but obviously that can be slower. Not everything is available like it would be with a straight NTFS provider like for C:, but you'll find those out pretty soon in terms of the properties that are available. But things like size are there, last modified, so you can help to write scripts for orphaned VMs and so on. Yeah, it's quite a lot of maintenance scripts out there. Use this PS drive interface, so you can look for orphaned VMs or large files, etc., to help prune and tune your environment. There is also automation available via PowerShell for Horizon, or HorizonView as the module is still called, but VMware don't like you calling it HorizonView, although it actually only has 3 commandlets within it. Once you're actually connected, you use services off the objects returned, although there is a helper library for that as well. So once you've connected to a HorizonView server, you can either then use the helper library, which is produced by VMware themselves, or you can actually use the objects directly themselves. And more recently, there's REST APIs available. So again, REST means you don't have any prerequisites in terms of PowerShell modules necessary, but you can still use PowerShell to drive that REST API through invoke REST method. Getting data back in JSON. Again, JSON is one of those formats that PowerShell reads and writes very well. So make your choice which one you're going to connect using. And some great examples out there on GitHub for HorizonView integration. I've written a few using that for Control Up. Again, you'll find that downloadable on their website and usable by PowerShell directly. You don't have to have their product installed. And like we saw with the default VI servers, we've got HV servers as well, so it can tell us whether we're connected and whether we actually have a default one set in our environment that will be connected to if I don't specify one when I'm calling connect HV server. So running out of time, as I always do, because I always try and get too much content in, so I'm going to have to rush through these a little bit. But again, the deck will be made available afterwards. So I think I said before, I generally put everything on one machine. So rather than trying to think, now which machine did I set that scheduled task up on? I use a jump box where I probably have all the consoles, all the SDKs, all the PowerShell modules, everything else I need installed. It's always on machine, so that there's a single point of failure maybe, but it depends how important your tasks are. If they are important, have two jump boxes, and have a way of making sure that the task only runs once, offset by a couple of minutes, and maybe have a trigger file somewhere. So scheduled tasks, great way of running this stuff, like I said right at the start. If you don't really want to be doing it at 4 AM unless the overtime rate's great. So again, what account do you run the task as? Can you run it as an AD account that's got the permissions that you need, but only the permissions that you need? So if it's mainly read-only stuff for reporting, don't make it a full admin. If you are going to have some credentials around, make sure you secure them. Secure strings in PowerShell are relatively secure. I use the word relatively, in that they can be decoded by the same user on the same machine. So if somebody resets the password for that account, they could steal the credentials, but then that means they've got to be an admin or have physical access. So you've probably got bigger problems to watch out for. A couple of things to watch out for when you're running scripts via scheduled tasks is that passing through true and false is a bit of a pain because PowerShell normally expands those. So if you have a scheduled task that runs PowerShell.exe with a script and something with $true or $false, it will actually pass them as a string. So you end up having to actually have a string type parameter, which then converts it to a Boolean. And also if you pass multiple machines, let's say, or multiple email recipients, something that's going to email, then you'll actually find it get passed as a single string. But again, you can use the minus split with a comma to say, well, let's turn it back into an array. It's just watch out for these things. The easiest way to check whether something's going to work is to take the command line that you're going to put into your scheduled task and paste it into a CMD on the machine where you're going to run it. So you don't actually have to worry about running as a scheduled task. So chances are if it runs there via CMD, it's going to run okay as a scheduled task. But of course, you've got the audit history for tasks, emails anyway. Again, you can set up your own alerting or reporting with send SMTP email. If you're going to be running these things manually, again, what account, what auditing do you want to have in place? Or do you add a GUI? So you saw my GUI. Again, I'm not really a GUI person. It's very easy with things like Visual Studio to knock up a quick GUI and then sort of hook up the code behind the scenes. Again, how do I do that? Just take an existing script. Go and look at my script, for instance. But GUIs don't have to be GUI based. It could be a menu driven one, which just puts out text. Press 1 to do this, press 2 to do that. Or you can use the Wizard Presentate window, WPF, as we call it, foundation, not framework. So what is the documentation-wise out there? Well, PowerShell ISE, if you use that. A lot of people say use Visual Studio Code. I'm old school because I write a lot of scripts on customer machines. I have to make sure I can use tools that I know are going to be available, which is ISE. But feel free to use PowerShell code. There's a lot of help built in with ISE. There's get help I've already shown, get command. So if you think, what VMware commandlets do stuff with the network. Well, there we go. And that'll just show me the things that get a network. And generally, as per Newton's law, opposites for every get action is generally equal opposite set action, although not guaranteed. All the documentation's online, of course, as you'd expect. Plenty of sample code as well. Yeah, if someone's written it already, why would you bother writing it yourself? And of course, good old web search. And that's it, me run out of time, unfortunately. But like I say, I'll make the slide deck available. It's got various links in. Hope you find that useful. Thank you very much.